Hello again. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to the difficulties involved in comparing different countries. As you know, countries in the world are very, very different from one another. They have different histories and different peoples, and what that means is that it's often hard to make coherent comparisons and draw lessons from those comparisons given that diversity. As a result, comparativists, that is, say, people who study comparative politics, disagree a lot about what the appropriate methodology, the appropriate way of studying and comparing countries is. And that those disagreements have actually made it a little bit more difficult for knowledge to be produced in comparative politics than other subfields or other disciplines where people agree on what the appropriate method is. So, like I suggested in the opening slide, cross-country comparisons can be tricky. For one, you can't really do natural experiments in a lab in the way that you could in the sciences. You can't just rerun history with slightly different variables, slightly different people, holding variables constant, and so on and so forth. You just can't do that. The world is not the lab for comparativists. And because of that, we have a hard time establishing what we call a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened to the same country with one variable changed. We never have access to this counterfactual in a way that you might be able to have in a lab when you are playing around with molecules and atoms. Now, another reason that cross-country comparisons are tricky, and I've already sort of mentioned it, is that countries are very dissimilar. Many things vary across countries at the same time, and that multiple variation can lead us astray. We can think that one source of variation is causing variation in outcomes, when in fact it's some other source of variation that we hadn't even thought about. Because of that, establishing good accounts of causality, that is to say, establishing good explanations, is trickier. Third, it's people we're dealing with. And this is something that's true across all social sciences, but particularly in comparative politics. People are difficult to predict. Even in identical situations, different individuals are apt to react differently. In fact, different individuals within the same culture and with similar psychologies can react differently. And until we can get inside people's brains, it'll be very, very difficult to predict what they're going to do. And even if we do get inside their brains, we might have a hard time. Studying people is not like studying molecules. People are different from one another, and they behave inconsistently, even as individuals. That is to say, even as an individual, you might do one thing one time, and then the next time you're faced with the same situation, you do something different. Because of that, social sciences are trickier than the natural sciences, and comparative politics is no exception to that rule. So from these three facts about the subject matter that we're studying, we have to conclude that the knowledge we get from comparative politics, like the knowledge we get from all political science, is probabilistic. That is to say, we can't make ironclad predictions or explanations. There are no real laws of comparative politics in the sense that there's laws of physics, right? At best, we can sort of say what the probabilities are, what the tendencies are. We can make contingent predictions, but we cannot say for certain what's going to happen. And for some people, of course, that makes comparative politics less useful. If we can't tell you what's going to happen, then what's the point? But at the same time, we can make some pretty good guesses. And we know if you talk to financial forecasters, for instance, in the finance industry, or if you talk to professional gamblers, the ability to predict the odds is actually quite valuable. And in those professions is actually quite lucrative. There is, in fact, some application of comparative politics in the professional world. And I've studied and even applied for some jobs in political risk analysis. There are firms out there, not too many, but there's a few firms in the world that whose job it is to predict the political risk level in different countries. They make assessments of whether countries are going to experience a big change in regime type or a big change in who gets voted in and what's going to happen when that person gets voted in. In other words, because this information is valuable to private businesses who are thinking about investing for the long term in a country, and of course they don't want to invest in an uncertain climate, or rather they would like to reduce the uncertainty when they're making an investment. And so there are some applications for the kind of knowledge you might get in comparative politics. Okay, so how do we go about comparing countries? Well, comparative investigations start with a hypothesis. This is true of all sciences. A hypothesis here simply means a claim that certain things cause other things to change. So one variable causes some other variable to change. So for example, that economic development or increase in incomes and average incomes causes a countries to become more democratic. That's a hypothesis. I'm not saying it's a true one. It's a much debated hypothesis. It's called modernization theory, but it's a hypothesis. Now, let me give you a caution. Causation, saying that one thing causes another, is complicated. It's complicated in social sciences particularly. Unlike atoms, people do have some influence on what they are. That is to say, we are self-reflective human beings, which means that we have, to some degree, agency. There's debates about whether we actually have free will, but we certainly have the ability to influence who we are over the long term. What this means is that many things can come together to produce unique sorts of events, and the importance of each particular cause in that chain of events that leads up to the event that you're studying is often difficult to sort out. You have things like proximate and ultimate causes, right? So you can say, all else equal, richer countries tend to be more democratic, and so in some sense, having more money causes a country to become more democratic, but that's a different question than why did a particular democratic transition happen at a particular date and time, right? It's not like national income ticked to a certain dollar amount, say 6,000, and then suddenly the country shifted to be democratic. So there's different kinds of questions that we're talking about. You've got ultimate causes, and the ultimate cause might have something of democratization, might have something to do with a country's level of economic modernization, but the timing of that democratic transition might have to do with completely different factors than income, right? The personalities and psychologies of leaders, the opportunities available in the political system, the weakening or aging of certain dictators, and so on and so forth. So why did X happen and why did X happen now are two different questions and have two different causal accounts associated with them. It's worth also noting, and I say this as an aside, that causation doesn't necessarily imply responsibility, right? In some sense, either God or the Big Bang is responsible for everything, or has caused everything. But that doesn't make God or the Big Bang responsible for everything, or not necessarily. The two sorts of claims are different. So just because X causes Y doesn't mean X is responsible for Y. And so I want to caution that is that when we start exploring what causes democracy, we sometimes say, oh, that was responsible for that happening. But of course, responsibility is a particularly human sort of concept, and it's a moral concept. It's a concept having to do with, it's a normative concept, right? Not an empirical one. So we're going to stick with causality, and we're not going to worry so much about responsibility in this class. So we said comparisons involve looking at how variables influence one another. A variable is simply a measurable phenomenon that changes across time or space. So the degree of education of a country is a variable. It changes. The degree of the income, the average income of a country changes, and so does its distribution. All these things are variables. Number of radios per capita, number of TVs or refrigerators or cars per capita. These are all variables about a country, and they change in different countries. Different countries have more or fewer cars, more or less public transportation, more or fewer infectious diseases, more or less sunlight, a longer or a shorter growing season, and so on and so forth. All of these are variables about countries. They change over time. Now, there are different kinds of variables out there, some of which are fairly simple and some of them which are fairly complicated. Let me give you an example. There's a difference between a variable like temperature and a variable like corruption. Both are variables, but temperature is in a sense epistemically objective, while corruption is epistemically subjective. What does that mean, epistemically objective? Well, epistemically objective simply means that temperature, that is to say how hot or how cold it is, can be defined independent of our perception. It can be defined independent of our perception. So if it's hot on a planet that we've never heard of, then it's hot. Whether we know about it or not, whether we can study it or not, whether it's hot or cold is not something that depends, right? It's not a variable that depends on our perception of it. On the other hand, corruption is epistemically subjective. What counts as corruption depends on how we choose to define it. Whether one definition of corruption is better than another will depend on how well it reflects our shared understanding of other epistemically subjective categories, like what counts as honesty or integrity or influence or service. So to say that the public officials in a country are corrupt, well, some people look at the American system and say, well, lobbying is a kind of corruption. It's a kind of exercise of influence, and it's an improper exercise of influence, whereas others say lobbying is basically shall we say, a form of information spreading, where you sit down, you have dinner with a senator, and you explain to the senator exactly why the senator should vote the way that you think he or she should. And there's nothing wrong with that. So again, what counts as corruption is largely culturally defined, and as a result, it's epistemically subjective, and it's trickier. People will disagree about measures of corruption in a very different way. People will largely not disagree about temperature, although they may choose to measure it in different ways. Okay, so if we want to use comparison to establish a causal relationship, that means establishing at least one dependent and independent variable, and usually a lot of independent variables. A dependent variable is the phenomenon a scientist is trying to explain. The independent variable is the thing that explains the dependent variable. So we're trying to explain what causes democratization. The dependent variable is democratization, right? It's the thing that varies. It's what we're trying to explain, whether a country is democratic or not, or what makes a country democratic or not. So the dependent variable is going to be a measure of how democratic a country is. And it could be a dichotomous variable, so it could be just have the value of 1 or 0, that is to say, yes, it's democracy, no, it's not a democracy. Or it could be a continuous variable. There's a measure in the Freedom House index that goes from 1 to 7, where 1 is most democratic and 7 is least democratic. Although I think they use the term politically free. And there it's a 7 scale variable. It's not a 1-0 variable. It's more of a continuous variable. Then there are independent variables, and the independent variables are what's doing the explaining. So in the video by Lauren Phillips that you have to watch, she shows how there's some literature out there that suggests that average income is the kind of thing that might explain whether a country is democratic or not. We just noticed that above about $6,000 per capita, countries are very often democratic, and below $6,000 per capita, countries are much more likely to be autocratic or dictatorships, right? So on that view, there's an independent variable, income per capita, which is causing something else to vary, namely whether a country is democratic or not. Of course, there's many more independent variables. There's lots of things that influence democracy. But that is the sort of explanation that we're looking for. X causes Y. One variable, one thing that varies, causes something else to vary. Now, comparatives, as I said in the beginning, comparativists disagree quite a bit about methods, and in particular they disagree about whether to use qualitative or quantitative methods. This is not a methodology course, so I'm not going to go too much into depth, but one thing to note is that which method you use depends a lot on what kind of knowledge you're trying to obtain. Perhaps you want to know a little bit of knowledge about many different countries or many different things, or you want to know a lot about a little. That is to say, you want a lot of knowledge about one case, right? So if you want to know a little about a lot, you use quantitative tools. So if you want to study 27 different countries, you can only study so many ways in which those countries vary. And so you're going to know a little bit about lots of countries. and so you're generally going to use statistics. Uh, when you want to know a lot about a little, that is to say, if you want to know a lot about China, or even more specifically than that, you want to know a lot about how leaders are selected in China, then you're going to use qualitative tools. Quantitative tools, I said, are statistical. Qualitative tools involve things like interviews, things like not so much surveys, although surveys can play a role. Largely interviews and observations that can't really be put into numbers, right? So you are ultimately trying to understand things without reducing everything to a variable that can be quantified. So if you see tables of numbers, it's quantitative. If you see um, lots of writing, it's probably qualitative. Now, in practice, qualitative methods, like I said, takes the form of statistical analysis. So you're comparing average GDPs of countries, corruption indexes, and so on and so forth. Again, it's quantitative because you're turning phenomena in the world into numbers. You're quantifying. Of course, the process of quantification is not without its detractors. There are people who think that you lose a lot by trying to quantify things that can't be quantified. So, in the article that you have talking about political culture, for example, the question becomes: can political culture be quantified? Can we come up with measures of a country's political culture, and are those measures even meaningful across countries? Quantitative analysis is more of a search for meaning, right? Or it's a way of talking about phenomena that resist quantification. So we know how rich the average American is and the average Mexican citizen is, but what does it mean to be rich in the United States versus Mexico? What kind of attitudes and what kind of significance does that wealth have? What can it buy? What can it buy? Uh, what kind of experience do people have when they are at one income level versus another one in a different country? This is quantitative because you're versus qualitative because you're. It's hard to reduce those experiences simply to numbers. Although there's people who love turning everything into a number, but you might say that's not always the point. That's not always the kind of knowledge that you're after when you're comparing countries. Now, like I said, comparativists hotly disagree about which methods are more suitable to what task. And indeed, they disagree about what kind of understanding political science should produce. What kind of knowledge should political science be in the business of producing? Uh, some political scientists really disagree with the idea that political scientists should try to predict the world. Um, they think that's just not that kind of knowledge that we can produce, and efforts to quantify things and predict are largely a pretense of knowledge. You're pretending to have knowledge that you really don't have because the world is too complex, because it's your variables are too subject to manipulation, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's also a value disagreement about whether political scientists should be really searching for like general laws of politics, right, that apply across countries, or whether they should be looking for particular knowledge of particular places and things in particular countries. Uh, of late, I would have to say that comparative politics has tended towards the former, has tended towards looking for general knowledge, and has been moving away from in-depth studies of particular countries. But that's just for now. I don't know what the 21st century will bring.